everybody. It is Miss Peachy again from your WCA Biology B course. And now we are finally in Unit 7. I'm still talking about natural selection, and our lesson for Lesson 2 is natural selection over time. Our key terms are adaptation, graph, heritable trait, melanistic gene frequency, and natural selection. So that second to last one, melanistic gene frequency, it's a bit of a tongue twister if you don't put the accent on the correct syllable. So as always, guys, click on the link under my video that is found on my website, and you will find our study guides for this unit. All right, so natural selection over time. So you guys have a pretty decent background in natural selection at this point from our previous unit. So we're going to talk a little bit here about Darwin and the Galapagos Islands, as well as some later studies that were done on the finches as well from the Galapagos. So we first tune into this lesson talking about how Charles Darwin sailed around the world on his ship, the HMS Beagle, and one of his stops along his many-year journey was in the Galapagos. And the Galapagos Islands are a chain of volcanic islands. It's right off the coast of South America, off the coast of Ecuador, it says here in South America. It's an interesting place to visit from what I hear. I would love to go and visit the Galapagos. It's on my bucket list. And because of its isolation, because it is off the mainland, for many, many, many years, the species kind of evolved without a lot of the same predators and things that they found on the mainland. And they are separated from each other, yet close enough together that each island itself was kind of an isolated ecosystem by itself as well. So it really provided a unique place to study. Keeping in mind that natural selection is a process by which individuals change over time due to inheritable traits or heritable traits that they possess that make them better adapted to that environment. And we call that ability to be adapted to your environment fitness, right? And that those traits are dependent upon the environment itself. So when the environment is different, then what traits make you more or less likely to survive also change as well, right? So going on to just remind you that these traits have to be things you can pass on from one generation to the next through your genes or in some other inheritable fashion. So these are known as heritable traits. And we'll talk a little bit about how not all of them come through genes. If we remember from last semester, we briefly talked about epigenetics and how there are things that are not actually genes themselves, but they are factors that control gene expression, and those are known as epigenetics, that they can also be heritable. So that's kind of our newest research in um, the study of inheritability genetics. So going on, it talks about there are four major parts of natural selection. In that study guide, I have a little graph, and in that graph, I want you to kind of fill out these four different parts of natural selection and summarize them. And it does help to kind of put them into your own words, even though it's tempting sometimes to just copy word for word. What putting it in your own words does is that it enables you to have a better kind of comprehension, I guess, of what it is we're talking about. That's kind of what I do here in this whole process of doing these videos with you, is I kind of summarize what's going on in the slide and put it into my own words, and hoping that having heard it in multiple different ways, it is something that is easier to understand for you as well. So overproduction and competition, um, there are more babies born than can survive, right? So when we look at the natural world, whether it is an insect that produces millions of eggs, or whether it is even just a mammal that produces one or two, that the ability for offspring to survive is not 100%. And because there are more offspring than can survive, that are born and can survive. In order to survive, you have to kind of maximize your ability to do so. Excuse me. So that competition between organisms of the same species for the resources that are needed to survive helps to fuel natural selection. The next one's genetic variation. As you guys know, there's variation in populations. That variation is oftentimes due to new combinations of genes. And those new combinations of genes can arise during meiosis. During meiosis, we have crossing over and independent assortment that occurs, which gives rise to new combinations of alleles that weren't present in the previous generation. You also have mutations that happen. And mutations actually give rise to whole new traits sometimes. And those new traits rarely, but sometimes they can be beneficial to organisms and actually allow those organisms an advantage to others that did not have that mutation. And so whole new traits can actually come out of nowhere, really, because due to a genetic mutation, that trait did not exist previously. It provides an advantage, and then it gets passed on to the next generation. And from one generation to the next, becomes um, more and more predominant, right, as time goes on. Then we have the process of selection. Organisms with the most helpful traits that can find resources can survive and reproduce. That's basically the premise of natural selection. It is essentially that, survival of the fittest component, right? And of course, inheritance and adaptation. Traits are passed from parent to offspring. Some of these traits are beneficial and help the organism to survive better. These are known as adaptations. They tend to accumulate in a population due to the environment and natural selection. So the environment is obviously a very important factor as well, as we saw in our previous unit, the end of our previous unit, that when the environment changes very quickly, as happens oftentimes when we see a mass extinction event, that even if an organism is very well adapted to the environment as it is, when the environment changes, those adaptations really don't mean anything anymore. They have to be specific to the environment in which the organism lives. So it provides an example of a fox and some mice. It's very, very similar to the example that I provide with the crow and the beetles. So you'll see that example in class as well. So the fox is hungry, wants to eat some mice. There are different allele or different phenotypes of mice that we see here. We see white mice, we see dark mice. And if the fox is trying to grab a mouse, it's more likely to grab the white mouse because it's easier to see against the black background. Therefore, there's going to be an increase in the prevalence of darker mice. This is what we call a melanistic gene frequency. So the frequency, the prevalence of a gene that codes for a darker color. And in this particular instance, the darker color is an advantage. It's an adaptation for those mice because due to the environment in which they live, which is a darker environment, it gives them a bit more camouflage. And you'll see a little bit later on in this lesson an example with peppered moths and kind of a similar type of example that the coloration actually is a camouflaging type thing. In some situations, maybe the coloration doesn't really have to do with camouflage as much as protection. We can see an increase in allele frequency of darker skin tone in areas in the world where you have a higher amount of UV radiation because that extra melanin actually provides protection from UV radiation, right? So we see definitely darker skin tones more so in equatorial and tropical and subtropical regions than we do in northern climates and in far southern climates due to the protective factor of melanin in skin providing protection from the UV radiation. And I mean, it goes on to talk a lot about different examples of adaptations. Talks a bit about this graph here. And here, I apologize, I have a cough drop in my mouth because my throat was tickling earlier. But here we can see changes in the length of beaks in finches over a period of roughly, looks like 1976 to 1984. So we're talking about 8 years, right? And then we're seeing a correlation in the increase in beak size with times where there is more of a drought. So during drought years, beak size is greater, and during wet years, beak size is smaller. Now, this is just one trait in this particular study. The study was done by, it's a very famous study done by two scientists, Rosemary and Peter Grant, over a very long period of time. And they lived in the Galapagos, and they actually captured finches and tagged them, and they watched them from generation to generation, and they found dead finches when the finches would die. And they didn't interfere with what was going on. They just kind of watched what was going on. And what they found is that there was a correlation between the length of the beak of finches and their food source. During dry years, the food sources were more scarce, and so beaks were changing to accommodate eating seeds that were a little harder to crack open. Let's see. There were so many different things that they were looking at here. Let's see. Yeah, it doesn't really get into specifics here, I don't think, as far as the types of food sources and stuff like that. It just says they were better able to utilize the food that was available on the island after the drought. And actually, they looked at a multitude of different traits, beak length, beak width. There was just a bunch of different things in various environmental conditions. So it wasn't just this particular example that really led them to deduce that there were definite changes that occurred in response to a changing environment. So you could definitely see changes in beak phenotype based on the environment itself. Um, Not permanent changes, as you can see here. These changes are fluctuating with the fluctuating environment. But if you can imagine a situation in which the environment changed permanently, you could see that that beak change could diverge and be more of a permanent change if the environment itself wasn't also fluctuating, right? And then finally, it also mentions epigenetics, which I briefly talked about a moment ago, in that not all changes that we see are not all heritable characteristics are actually inherited through your DNA. More recently, scientists have realized that there are other factors that lead to inheritability, namely that there are ways in which genes can be turned on and turned off. So it affects the expression of genes, and we call this epigenetics. There are changes that affect the expression of genes, not the genes themselves necessarily. And these factors can be inherited as well from parent to offspring. And they can be triggered by environmental changes. So, an environmental change can trigger an epigenetic change, which then can be passed on to the next generation. Now, I know we're only on slide 2 here, so I really want to make sure that I emphasize that just because you're watching the video doesn't mean you should be done with reviewing for the lesson. There's lots of other things in here, examples, questions, practice problems, videos that I would like you to make sure you watch, and stuff that we don't go through in these overview summary videos. So make sure you're doing this stuff as well, because some of this will also show up on your quizzes and give support to all the things we've talked about in my recordings. So that's it for this one, guys. I will see you in the next. Let me know if you have questions. Take care. Bye-bye.